morning, and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Rachel Kinderdine, Community Manager, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Today, we're joined by Ian Johnson, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of Sparks, China's Underground Historians and Their Battle for the Future. We are also joined by our moderator, Jeffrey Wasserstrom, Chancellor's Professor of History at UC Irvine. For those of you who would like to submit questions for our speakers, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. I'll be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 35 minutes. Thank you both so much for being here, Ian and Jeff, and I'll ask you to come on and I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, it's great to be back here, involved with another program by the World Affairs Council and Town Hall, and to see my friend Ian Johnson, whose new book I think is truly wonderful and is the third book he's written about China, and I think these can be seen in some ways as a trilogy of sorts. So one of the things that I'm hoping to draw Ian out about is the connection between those books, because he wrote a first one, Wild Grass, that has some related concerns with civil society within China and people working to try to bring about change within the society. And then a second one, Souls of China, which was about religious belief and the varieties of religious belief in China. And I think there are connections with both of these and this book. All of them, I think what links them is they're elegantly written and based on a lot of time spent hanging out with people and trying to get them to tell him their stories and then him tell those stories to a broader public. So what I thought we would do, Ian's been touring around presenting his book, giving talks. I've had the pleasure of getting to hear him present about them. So I thought one way to mix things up a little bit would be for me to describe some of the things that stand out about the book and about the talks from reading the book. And there have been excerpts published that some of you listening in may have read. You may have seen reviews. And I'll mention just a few things that have stood out for me and ask him how they fit in with his own thinking about the book.
Thanks, Jeff. That sounds like a great idea. It'll be something a little bit different. There was an extended excerpt in the New York Times in September, and then this past weekend, the Wall Street Journal did a shorter excerpt, and there's also something in the China Project. So yeah, it'll be interesting to hear what your thoughts are on the book, and then we can get into a feisty debate about that. I'm sure not.
Yeah, you may. I may tell you that I thought one part of the book was great, and you may tell me that's a lousy one. So one of the things is you clearly at the center of the book are some people who you call underground historians. Could also be thought of as documentarians, because what they're trying to do is document things that have been going on in the past, the kinds of things that the Chinese Communist Party would often like people to forget about or intentionally try to suppress information about. I was struck, I got to hear Qingquan Li, the wonderful sociologist of China at UCLA, respond to your talk, and she brought up the fact of a resonance with what's going on in the world today, in the sense that she was reading the book at the same time she was reading about contemporary atrocities and traumas, and thinking about the question of what will be remembered later and what will be suppressed. So there was that side of the book that I think we could talk about, its resonances with the present. But I wanted to begin by saying that, and this is true for those who've read the New York Times excerpt, you put at the center of this book female recorders of history. Really, the two people I think we hear the most about are women. And I wonder if that was an intentional choice, and if you could just describe those women and how they ended up at the center of the book. Maybe that would be a good place to start, because it is something that really stood out for me.
Yeah, so the book covers a wide span of history, going back to the before the founding of the People's Republic of China, nearly 75 years ago, to the communist base in northwestern China, all the way up to the COVID protests of last year, and various efforts by Chinese people to record other parts of their history, parts that don't match the Communist Party's rather rosy view of the past 75 years. Not that there haven't been rosy things, economic growth and so on, which are all real, but they're trying to record other sides of it. And I did not set out to write a book where women were at the center of it. I set out to just find the best stories possible and the most representative and the people who'd done the most interesting work and so on and so forth. And it ended up that the two characters that unite the book, sort of who are there almost at the beginning and all the way to the end, is this feminist scholar and documentary filmmaker Ai Xiaoming and this independent journalist Jiang Xue. They both are people who are quite well known inside China in various circles in China. They're not super famous abroad, I don't think, but I think in China they're pretty well known. And why there are more women than men at the center of my book. I mean, there are obviously men in the book as well, but they tend to come and go in various parts of the book. And of course, Xi Jinping is a man, in case anyone was wondering, and he's plays a big role in the book. But I think it could be, and I wondered about this. It seems to me that women are outsiders in some ways in China. That they are they're part of Chinese society, obviously, but they're not full members of Chinese society, especially the political ruling apparatus in China. There's no women in the 7-man standing committee of the Politburo. There's no women in the 30-member Politburo. I believe not one woman. I believe this is quite remarkable. There's often at least been 1 or 2 token women in there. And in the central committee of about 100, there might be 4 or 5 women. So you see at the very top of the Communist Party, women are cut out of society, and even very moderate movements for equality for women are now criminalized in China. That if you try to set up a feminist organization just for equal pay or something like that, something that should be acceptable to most governments in some way, it shouldn't, at least not criminal, that they're completely ostracized. And so I think that for being a woman in China, and this is something I've talked about, especially with Jiang Xue, one of the main characters, who's thinking of writing a book on this herself, just a specific topic. You're at once at the center, you're in society, but you're also never allowed to fully participate, and that gives you, I think, a slightly different viewpoint. And I think also if we look at exile groups in the United States or elsewhere, Chinese exile groups, a lot of them are dominated by kind of giant male egos, and they're riven by these kind of factions and internecine warfare between these different exile groups. And women tend to be, and I'm stereotyping or generalizing at least massively here, but they seem to be getting more things done than in these typical exile groups, dissident groups, where not too much actually gets done. But these are people who are making films. Ai Xiaoming's made over 20 documentary films. Jiang Shui's written some of those popular essays in the Chinese internet and so on. So that's why I think they're at the center of the book.
That's really interesting. And I mean, in one case that you didn't mention, you bring Tibet in via the character of Wasser. And she's a fascinating figure, but there probably wasn't any choice. There isn't any comparable male figure who's a Tibetan voice for Tibet within China in difficult situations. Were you surprised that you could talk to her at all, or that you could? Are you surprised that somebody doing what she's doing is able to keep doing it in Beijing? And could you tell the audience a little bit about her?
Yeah, Wozer is a fairly well-known poet inside and outside China. She has several people who translate a lot of what she does, so her essays and her poems and so on, so that she's kind of well-known abroad. But she so it comes from a Tibetan family that was part of the system. Her father was a soldier in the People's Liberation Army, and he died around 1996. He wasn't that old, but he was like 60 years old or something like that. But and he, in the later years of his life, he was compulsively, she thought, she had moved back to Tibet after studying in Chengdu, and he was going through these files of photos and annotating them and organizing them. She'd always see him working at this, but she didn't know what it was. She thought he was just a amateur photographer, maybe looking at his, photo snaps he'd taken at Beijing at Tiananmen Square or something like that. And it turns out, so he died and he left her these 400 photos, and she wasn't sure what to do with them. She looked at them and held the negatives up. These are mainly negatives. She held them up to the light, and she saw these were pictures of the destruction of Tibet in the Cultural Revolution, precisely annotated by her father with no commentary, but just very clearly annotated what day, what time the photo was taken. And she didn't know why he took the pictures. He clearly had a very good camera, which in 1960s China, especially in Tibet, was unusual, and he was in the PLA. So it must have been with official approval, but she didn't know what his purpose was. Was he supposed to be celebrating the destruction of this feudal, backward civilization, or was he trying to document it? But the fact that he later put everything in order implied that he realized he'd seen something historically significant. And so she, being a very modest person, she wasn't sure what to do with all of this. She was more of a novelist and a poet. And so she sent it to a well-known Chinese guy named Wang Lixiong, who later became her husband. And he'd just written a book about Tibet and China that the Dalai Lama had endorsed as being moderate, and which had been published in China. This is in the late 1990s, when there was still some hope that there could be some rapprochement or some kind of a deal struck. And he said, I can't, what you have is incredibly historically significant, but it's not for me to write, to publish this. You have to do it. You're Tibetan. And so he put it back to her. And then she went back and did follow-up interviews with the people in the photos or their descendants, went back to the places, tried to make new photos of the places, and she published a book about it. And it's a rare documentation of what happened in Tibet, because there are almost very few photos of the destruction of Tibet. And here we have precise time. So we know some temples were destroyed, but we don't know when or how. And here are these photos saying exactly when they were destroyed. So they're not just they don't just illustrate the destruction, they create historical knowledge by letting us know exactly what happened in Tibet during the Cultural Revolution. So this is one of the typical people who are somewhat autodidactic. They're not PhDs in history. There are some people in my book who are like that, but most of them have found a mission in life to record something because something just hit them, like this hit her.
You're drawn to a kind of, you're drawn to somewhat eccentric figures or people passionate about a specific thing. And actually, I wanted to bring something up that one of the books that I made a big impression on me, and I think maybe she even presented on it to this same organization when it came out, was Louisa Lim's People's Republic of Amnesia, and which was about the sort of effort to bring about a kind of enforced forgetting of Tiananmen and the massacres of 1989. And your book, initially, when I was hearing you talk about it, I thought it was a kind of argument with that discussion of amnesia, because you're trying very hard to say that people are keeping these memories alive, and that there hasn't been a complete brainwashing, which we're always kind of worried about happening with a new generation. But you said you recently did a podcast with Louisa, and the two of you saw the books as somehow related. So could you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm sure some in the audience are familiar with it.
Yeah, that was kind of funny, because around the same time that I did the podcast with Louisa, the Council on Foreign Relations asked me to put together some teaching notes that might be of use to teachers at universities. And we were supposed to come up with these kind of essay questions. And so I say, it appears that Lim and Johnson come to very different conclusions. Discuss why that is. And so then she said to me on the podcast, Ian, I want to ask a cheeky question. do you think we do come at it from different points of view? And I say, well, we do kind of, but we're two sides of the same coin because the government is trying to erase history. And I talk about this in the book. I have a couple of chapters on why history matters so much to the Communist Party. Why, of course, history matters in every country, but it's especially relevant in China. It is one of the central pillars of legitimacy for the Communist Party. And they try everything possible to manipulate the historical record to make their rule look as favorable as possible. But there are also these other people who are fighting against it, and I think that they are the two stories are related and not necessarily in opposition. I guess it depends. It's not really a glass half full, half empty thing. I don't think the glass is half full, but I'm just trying to show that there's something in the glass. It's not sometimes especially since coming to CFR 2.5 years ago and going to Washington and seeing the discussions. I get the feeling that the dominant view of China is that the place is everyone's brainwashed. Xi Jinping completely runs absolutely everything and has the country completely locked down. And I think the events, for example, the past year have shown that this isn't accurate. And these people also show that this isn't accurate. Although he does have huge power, he is very, very strong, dominant, brutal, but there are independent voices still.
So I think that brings to that segues nicely to the another part of your book that I wanted to draw you out on, which is there's a tendency, and I think with 1989, this looms large, to sort of say, is China at this kind of tipping point like 1989 that we saw in Eastern and Central Europe, where, again, there too, people thought of those places as being places where a degree of brainwashing had been effective, and then suddenly there's this uprising. There are these uprisings that topple the regime after previous failures. You in the book look at Central and Eastern European parallels, but you're not looking at 1989. You're not saying China is like Central Europe in 1989. You actually bring up the Soviet Union in the 1960s. Could you explain what you mean by that? And also, you bring up the idea of samizdat, this form of underground documentation that was important in the Soviet Union, but also in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, all those kinds of places where you had a struggle between the official version of history and other ones. So when you bring up the Soviet Union, but not right before the fall, not looking for signs of a Gorbachev, but actually something where it might still be we might still be dealing with a version of Communist Party rule in China for a couple of decades, but I assume you think we won't be dealing with it forever. So anyway, could you talk a little bit about that, why you hit that sort of period?
Yeah, I went into that also in depth in this foreign affairs piece that I wrote in not the most recent, but the September issue of Foreign Affairs. I call it Xi's Age of Stagnation. And I think that some people ask me, well, isn't this just like the 1980s when there were groups like Memorial, which would later, I think, win a Nobel Peace Prize for uncovering the horrors of the Stalin era and actually exhuming mass graves and things like that. And that was part of this project that helped topple the Soviet Union, destroy the legitimacy of the Soviet Union, so that less than 10 years later it collapsed. I don't think we're like that. I went to East Germany in 1988, and this was a country where there was a 16-year waiting line list for a Trabi, one of those old little two-stroke cars. And so they were sort of like, come back in the year 2005 or 06 or something, pick up your Trabi. And I actually have photos of that. They were in the showroom window, and so you'd be planning really, for the long term if you're going to buy a car there. And they didn't have a lot of consumer goods, and Russia, the Soviet Union, was even worse off, where there were even bread lines and vodka was rationed at various times and things like that. China's of course not like that. I mean, China, we know that China is a prosperous country. It's not like the Soviet Union, which in hindsight I think we now realize was, especially toward the end, was hollowed out. It had this big military infrastructure. It was a legitimate threat, of course. It did have all these nuclear weapons and so on, a big military and so on, but it didn't have the economy to really support it. China is quite different, but if you wanted to make a comparison, despite all of the fraught caveats you have to have with historical comparisons. I'd say it's more like the 1960s when Brezhnev was sort of newer. Soviet Union seemed robust. It was still leading in many things. It was, about to lose the parts of the space race to the United States, but overall was still right at the top. And people like Solzhenitsyn were just kind of starting out, and they weren't as well known in their countries as they would later become when things were more fraught. And I think that's maybe where we are in China. If we're in, and this isn't to say there's some inevitable decline and fall about to happen in China over the next 20 years, but I do think that we're this, just as the seeds then were sown for a kind of stasis and stagnation, ossification of the regime. We're seeing that now very clearly in China. Now, it's not to say that things can't be turned around. The Communist Party, over its 100-year history, has shown the ability to correct, to take self-corrective measures. But the way things are going now, it doesn't seem like they're doing that. So this is why I think it's at least now fair enough to say that it is a period of stagnation.
So have you been seeing any new things about your book now that you've been touring it, now that you've been getting questions, now that you've been having discussions with people? You've had a very interesting mix of people that have been, I was looking at who else had been in my role in other events, and you did one event with Gal Beckerman, who's written about Samizdat and written about social movements in different parts of the world, with Ishan Tharoor, who writes about international affairs really wonderfully for the Washington Post. So presumably Li Jiazhang, somebody who grew up in China during the period you're writing about. So is there anything that you found particularly interesting or seen new things about the book in the process of talking about it?
Yeah, a couple of points. One, it was interesting to talk about this with Gal Beckerman. He's written this wonderful book called, I have a copy of it right in front of me almost. It's called The Calm Before, as in the calm before the storm. And he says that we're often fascinated by the big violent outbursts, the street protests that happen that topple things. Obviously, that's news, and we see it right now happening, for example, in the Middle East. But in terms of social movements, he says the key is more the preceding period of time when things are calm, but there's stuff percolating below the surface. And if you want to understand a social movement, you have to look at that and see what dynamics are going on there. And for successful social movements, they tend to have this networking that goes on at the low key level. And I feel like this is what this is what I am trying to describe in this book, and why I wanted to have the conversation with Gal, because the movement I'm describing is not a mass movement with hundreds of millions of people challenging the CCP on its history, but it is a significant group of people, a kind of collective memory that didn't exist before. And that to me was interesting to talk. I think the other thing, which was maybe a little more surprising, was the number of young people who have come to all my talks, young Chinese people, and they are often very passionately engaged in China there, and in a critical way. I mean, they're not anti-China. They're concerned about their country, and they're concerned about the events. For many of them, for anybody in China under 30, or maybe even under 35, or perhaps even 40, this is the first big crisis they experienced. There was Tiananmen in '89. But in those 30 years since then, although there have been many problems and challenges, for example, the smashing of the Falun Gong spiritual movement in 1999 and 2000, but in terms of a mass movement, this whole COVID thing, the slowing economy, the high youth unemployment of 20%, this is a first for them. And they see that the tightening of restrictions, for example, even on things like women's groups, which shouldn't be so controversial, things like LGBTQ plus, which again shouldn't be so controversial. It doesn't challenge the CCP, but it somehow the party has made enemies of all these people. And so you have young people in the West, but not just the West, but in open societies around the world, in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, in Japan, who are young Chinese people who are in touch with people back in China and who are trying to think of a way out, who are holding these democracy salons and so on. It really reminds me of the period after '89, which after Tiananmen, which I experienced in Berlin, in Germany. There were people that set up these things called Tiananmen University. And this is where they're trying to analyze, what had happened? Why did the massacre take place? What's wrong with our country? You get a similar movement, a similar vibe today, but it's obviously different because it's 30 years later, 35 years later. So, but that to me has been really interesting and quite hopeful, I thought.
So I agree with everything you said, except I am going to correct you on one thing. The book is The Quiet Before, even though I kept thinking it was
You're right, The Quiet Before.
Is it the same notion, The Quiet Before the Storm? And I do think what you're describing fits very nicely into his idea of this possible percolation under the surface. And then we saw it bubble up to the surface with the white paper protests that were almost exactly a year ago. And were really surprising. Even I think it's important as China specialists to periodically say, because there's a kind of papering over like, oh yeah, we could have seen that coming. Here were the things. It was shocking to me that there was the banner hung from the Sitong Bridge in Beijing in September or October, sorry, of last year, when the city was on high alert because there was going to be a big political meeting. Everything was surveyed. We hear about how many cameras there are around Beijing, and somebody still, in an act what was a kind of almost political suicide, hung up banners that directly attacked official policies, that directly called for an end to dictatorial things, and managed to know that photographs would be taken of it and circulate around the world, even though he knew he would be arrested and the banners would come down. That was an amazing moment. That was surprising. And then the white paper protests a little bit after that were surprising. So were they surprising to you as well? Or were you thinking that something like that was bound to happen at some point?
Well, no, I didn't think anything like that was bound to happen. There had been signs of anger before last October. For example, at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, there was the big lockdown in Xi'an, the big Western Chinese city of like 8 or 9 million people, and that caused a huge uproar. And that was followed a few months later by this Pyrrhic victory that they had in locking down Shanghai, which also caused a huge outcry and just, I think, disbelief among people that they were still doing lockdowns, still in zero COVID, even though the rest of the world was moving on. The rest of the world, certainly the developed world, had mRNA vaccines. Things were opening up and loosening up again, and China was still stuck in this Groundhog Day cycle or whack-a-mole cycle of, stop COVID in this town and everything's okay for a month or two, and then smash this one. And as we now learned, I don't think we knew. Certainly didn't know at the time. This was bankrupting local governments because the cost of all of this stuff, whether it's the secret police surveillance of dissidents or COVID or whatever, it's always pushed down to the local governments. So it was local governments, even like the city of Nanjing or some other really big megacities or Xi'an, they're locking down the population, and every few days they're having to do tests of everybody in the city. It was incredible amount of money that they were spending. And so this was percolating up. There were some little signs of it, but I didn't see that happening. And I certainly I really didn't predict the government's about face at the end of 2022, at the end of last year, this almost irresponsible dropping of zero COVID with no preparation. People were asking me last summer, this summer of 2022, when would the government be dropping COVID at any time in the next few months? And I was advising people, so take what you hear from think tanks with a grain of salt. I was saying, no, I don't think that'll happen because we will see signs of this. There's a joint venture signed between BioNTech, which is the German company that provided a lot of the know-how for the Pfizer vaccine, between BioNTech and Fosun, a Chinese pharmaceutical company, but they'd never been given the green light to produce it because the government was clearly trying to get their own homegrown mRNA. but if they're going to relax it, they're going to bring in mRNA vaccines. They're going to vaccinate the population again, because they had vaccinated it with the Chinese vaccines, but it'd been quite a while. They'll lay in stocks of antiviral medicines, and said they did none of that. And they went from zero COVID policy to just zero policy. It was just boom, you're on your own, see you later. And before you knew it, there were, upward of 1 million people dying in China within just basically a 2-month period, which was a huge shock to people, as I found out when I went back in May. So
Yeah.
last year was really like Xi Jinping's annus, horribilis, I think, probably the worst year he's faced as leader of China.